The cuffs went on too tight. Callista Washington felt the metal teeth dig into the soft skin above her wrist bones with every jostle of the patrol car. Each bump in the road a small, deliberate punishment. In the front seat, the laughter hadn't stopped since Rosie's diner. It bounced off the plexiglass divider like something alive, filling the cabin with the particular arrogance of two men who believed, completely and without question, that they had just won. They hadn't won anything. They had just made the single worst professional decision of their careers, though neither of them would understand that for another 7 minutes. Officer Ernest Flynn, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, 22 years on the force, had looked at a woman in a gray sweatsuit sitting quietly in a corner booth, nursing a black coffee, and seen exactly what his bias told him to see. A problem. Someone who didn't belong. Someone whose presence required an explanation he had every right to demand. He had no idea he had just put handcuffs on his new boss. This is the story of how a Tuesday morning power trip became a career obituary, and why the most dangerous assumption a man can make is that he already knows exactly who he's dealing with. The ignition of Callista Washington's black SUV clicked off at 7:14 a.m., the engine ticking quietly as it cooled in the parking lot of Rosie's diner. She sat for a moment behind the wheel, studying the building through the windshield. A hand-painted sign, red vinyl booths visible through smudged glass. The kind of place where nothing ever changed, which was precisely why she had chosen it. At 46, Callista Washington moved through the world with the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who have spent decades being watched. She was full-figured, dark-skinned, with neat box braids pulled back from her face and eyes that cataloged everything they landed on and filed it away permanently. On any other morning, she would be in a boardroom or a courtroom or a federal briefing room, commanding every ounce of attention in it. 20 years with the Department of Justice. 3 landmark civil rights cases that rewrote departmental policy in 4 states. The kind of resume that made city mayors clear their schedules. This morning, she was wearing a light gray zip-up hoodie over a white fitted tee, matching gray sweatpants, and clean white sneakers. No bag. No ID clipped to her collar. No briefcase. Nothing that would give her away. She stepped out of the vehicle, rolled her shoulders once, and walked toward the diner's glass door. The mayor of Millbrook had hired Callista specifically because no one in the department knew her face yet. She had been announced by name only 72 hours ago. A phantom appointment from out of state, chosen precisely because she owed nothing to anyone inside that precinct. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., she would stand in the city's main hall and be sworn in as the new police commissioner. Tonight, the department's officers would pull up her photograph for the first time and understand exactly who was coming. But this morning, she was nobody, and she intended to stay that way long enough to learn the truth. She pushed open the glass door, and the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee wrapped around her like a familiar thing. She found a booth in the far back corner, the one with sightlines to the door, the counter, and the parking lot, and slid in without taking off her hoodie. A waitress named Carol, 50s, moving carefully on swollen ankles, appeared with a coffee pot. "Black, please," Callista said, and the eggs scrambled. She wrapped both hands around the mug when it came and began to watch. What she saw in the first 11 minutes did not surprise her. It confirmed everything the complaints database had been trying to tell her for 3 weeks. The 2 officers already seated at the counter, young, both of them, both in uniform, spoke to Carol with the casual condescension of people who had never once been told no. When the busboy, a teenager who could not have been older than 16, bumped one of their arms reaching past to clear a plate, the officer grabbed his wrist and said something low and private that made the boy go very still. Callista noted the officer's badge number. She noted the time. She was still noting when the bell above the diner door swung hard and the room changed. It wasn't a sound that changed it. It was a pressure. The kind of atmospheric shift that happens when something predatory enters a space full of prey. Callista looked up over the rim of her mug. Officer Ernest Flynn filled the doorframe before he stepped through it. He was big in the way of men who had been physically impressive once and now relied on the memory of it. Broad through the shoulders, silver-haired, with a beard cropped close enough to look intentional. His utility belt was loaded and loud. He moved through the door the way men move through spaces they consider theirs by right, and his eyes swept the diner the way a property owner checks a rental. Assessing, owning, dismissing. Behind him came his partner, younger by at least 15 years, dark-haired, sharp-jawed, with a smile already creasing his face that had no particular reason behind it yet. The smile of a man who laughed at jokes before he heard the punchline because he had learned that was what you did when you wanted to belong to someone like Flynn. They didn't sit down. Flynn's gaze moved across the room in slow, deliberate sweeps. Passed over the couple by the window, over the contractor at the counter, over Carol refilling coffee, and then it landed on Callista's booth and stopped. She watched him nudge his partner with one elbow without looking away from her. She set her coffee cup down, very slowly, with both hands visible on the table. Flynn walked over with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in 22 years been told to stop. He hooked his thumbs into his belt and looked down at her from the full advantage of his height and his uniform and his certainty that this situation was already resolved. "Help you with something?" Callista asked. "That's what I was going to ask you," Flynn said. His voice was pleasant in the way that knives are pleasant, designed to look harmless until the moment they aren't. "You waiting for someone? Or just sitting? Just having breakfast?" He let the sound sit there. "We got a call. Somebody matching your description was seen loitering in this area. Couple of complaints from the other patrons." Callista looked slowly around the diner. Not one patron was looking at them. The contractor at the counter had found something extremely interesting in his toast. Carol had disappeared entirely. "I'd like your badge number, please," Callista said. The shift in Flynn's face was fast and total. The pleasantness evaporated. What replaced it was something older and much less complicated. The simple anger of a man who was not accustomed to being spoken to that way by someone in a gray sweatsuit sitting alone in a diner booth. "Get up," he said. "Am I being detained?" "I said get up." His partner had moved without Callista noticing, positioning himself to her left, bracketing her against the wall. She saw him clock her noticing and smile wider for it. Flynn's hand came down on the edge of the table. Not a slam, but firm, deliberate, designed to make a sound the room would register. "You're making a mistake," Callista said. Her voice had not changed in pitch or temperature. "I'm going to reach slowly into my right hoodie pocket and show you my identification. That will end this." "You're not reaching for anything," Flynn said. Then his hands were on her arms, and she was being pulled upright from the booth with the efficient violence of someone who had done this enough times that it no longer required thought. The partner had her left side. The cuffs came out. The laughter started. Flynn's low chuckle. His partner's higher and brighter. A sound that filled the diner and made the contractor put down his fork. The cold metal closed around both wrists. Too tight. One notch past necessary, which Callista understood was not an accident. "Ladies and gentlemen," Flynn announced to the room with theatrical warmth, steering her away from the booth. "Rosie's is now a little bit safer." His partner laughed. Someone in the diner did not. The sound of a chair scraping back. Someone standing. Callista couldn't turn to see, but she heard it. She filed it. She walked out through the diner with her chin parallel to the floor and her eyes recording everything. The back of a police interceptor is engineered for one purpose: to make the person inside it feel small. The seat is hard molded plastic curved at an angle that punishes posture. The leg room assumes a person folded in half. When your hands are cuffed behind your back, your shoulders begin a quiet, grinding protest within 90 seconds that becomes louder with every turn of the wheel. Callista Washington sat with her spine straight anyway. She breathed in a 4-count rhythm she had developed in federal raid preparation, a technique for keeping the heart rate calibrated and the mind clear and cold. Her thigh ached where Flynn's knee had caught the common peroneal nerve during the cuffing, a precise, practiced strike that caused maximum pain and minimum visible bruising. She noted it. She noted everything. In the front seat, the morning had become a celebration. "Did you see her face when I told her about the complaints?" Flynn said, catching Callista's eyes in the rearview mirror and holding them with an expression she had seen before and still found remarkable in its completeness. The look of a man who had never in his life imagined he might be wrong. "Classic. She actually asked for your badge number," his partner said, shaking his head with the delight of someone recounting a good joke. Like that was going to work. "They always think they know the system," Flynn said. "Spend enough time on the wrong side of it, I guess." He took a turn at a speed that sent Callista sliding against the door, her shoulder catching the handle with a dull shock of pain. "Careful," his partner offered, not bothering to sound like he meant it. Callista pressed her back against the seat and stared through the wire mesh at the road ahead. She had stopped responding to them in the first 30 seconds. There was nothing to gain from it and a great deal to lose, specifically her composure, which she intended to need in perfect working condition very shortly. She was memorizing instead. Unit number stenciled on the interior door panel. Flynn's badge number, visible in the rear view.
Partner S-Name Tag, E. Flynn, R. Caruso.
Time of arrest, 7:31 a.m. She replayed the moment Flynn had struck her nerve, counting the witnesses. She recalled the man at the counter who had put down his fork. She recalled the sound of the chair scraping back when someone stood. "Hey," Flynn called back through the mesh, his tone shifting to the particular register of false benevolence that preceded a shakedown. "You want to tell me what's really going on? Because if you've got something in that hoodie, better to deal with it now than at the station. Could save us all a lot of time." "I have nothing to say to you," Callista replied. "That right?" He watched her in the mirror. "Smart. Lawyer up. You know the drill." "You have no idea what I know," she said, and looked back out the window. Flynn laughed. His partner laughed. The precinct appeared ahead through the windshield. A wide concrete building the color of old institutional certainty, brick-fronted, flagged at the entrance, surrounded by squad cars ranked in tidy rows. Callista had seen its file. She had read every civilian complaint lodged against it in 5 years. She knew its clearance rates and its lawsuit history and the names of the 3 officers currently under internal investigation. She had been scheduled to walk through that front door tomorrow at 9 a.m. for her first official address to the full department. She was arriving a day early. She was arriving differently than planned. But she was arriving. The cruiser rolled into the secure bay, and the heavy door groaned shut behind them, sealing the bay in yellow artificial light. "End of the line," Flynn announced, putting the car in park. He opened her door and took her by the upper arm in a grip designed to communicate ownership, steering her toward the intake entrance with a push that was 1 degree past necessary. Callista moved with it, not against it. She stepped through the door. The booking room was loud, the way institutional spaces are loud. Phones, keyboards, low conversation, the mechanical indifference of a place that processed human beings in volume. It smelled of industrial cleaner and burned coffee and something older underneath both. Several officers moved through the space in various directions. 3 worked at desks. At the main booking counter sat a sergeant Callista recognized from the organizational chart she had memorized 2 weeks ago. Sergeant Donald Bryce, 28 years on the force, commendations for community liaison work in his first decade and a spotless disciplinary record in the 20 that followed. Careful man. A man who paid attention. He was reading a report when they came in. He didn't look up immediately. "What V you got, Flynn?" Bryce asked. "Disturbance at Rosie's," Flynn said, steering Callista toward the counter with one hand still on her arm. "Belligerent. Wouldn't ID, wouldn't cooperate. Probable cause on the loitering complaint and resisting." "I did not resist," Callista said clearly, to the room. "Quiet," Caruso said. Bryce looked up over his reading glasses. He looked at Flynn. Standard issue, unhurried sergeant's assessment of an incoming arrest. Then his gaze moved to the woman in handcuffs beside him. It moved there and stopped. His face did not change all at once. It changed the way ice changes. Slowly at first, then suddenly and completely, as if a structural thing had given way beneath the surface. The report he was holding lowered to the counter with the careful movements of a man who needed his hands to be doing nothing else right now. He stood. "Ernest," Bryce said, very quietly. The word had no other words attached to it. It stood alone in the air between them like something with weight. Flynn frowned. The frown of a man who was still not worried, only confused by another person's inexplicable reaction. What is it?" Bryce came around the counter. Slowly. His eyes had not left Callista's face. When he reached them, he stopped and looked at her directly, and his expression was the expression of a man reading a verdict that had already been decided. "Ma'am," he said, and the word was different from the way Flynn had used sweetheart in the diner. It carried something Flynn's words never had. Recognition. I need to ask if you're all right." "I'm fine, Sergeant," Callista said. "Thank you for asking." Flynn looked between them. The first real note of uncertainty had entered his face, distant and unfamiliar, like a sound he didn't have a name for yet. "Tom. Bryce. What is going on?" "She's a perp. I ran her in on a disturbance call." Bryce turned to him slowly. His voice, when it came, was barely above a murmur. But in the silence that had begun spreading outward through the room as other officers looked up and registered something wrong in the sergeant's posture, it carried to every corner. "Brock," he said, "do you know who this is?" Flynn looked at Callista. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the diner, scanning, categorizing, dismissing. Then he looked back at Bryce, and his answer was clear in the silence before he gave it. "No," he said. "Should I?" The room had gone quiet. Not the quiet of a room where people stopped talking. The quiet of a room where people stopped moving. Keyboards had ceased. A phone rang twice and went unanswered. An officer in the far corridor had stopped walking and stood very still, watching. Callista Washington turned her head and looked at Ernest Flynn for the first time since the diner without the neutral mask in place. What replaced it was not anger. It was something quieter and more durable than anger. It was assessment, final and complete. "My identification," she said, "is in the right pocket of my hoodie. I'd like someone to retrieve it, please." Bryce reached into the pocket himself, carefully, with the hands of a man who understood the gravity of what he was touching. He withdrew a slim leather credential wallet. He opened it. He held it up. The room saw it before Flynn did. Callista watched the information travel outward from Bryce's hands in a wave. A desk officer's jaw went slack. A young officer near the window took a step backward. Someone in the corridor said something very short and very quiet that was not quite a word. Flynn's eyes moved to the credential. "Read it." Moved away. Came back. "Commissioner Callista M. Washington Millbrook Police Department." The silence in the booking room was no longer merely quiet. It had texture and mass. Pressed. Flynn's face moved through several expressions in close succession, none of them ones he would have chosen voluntarily. The smirk was the first to go. The certainty went next. What was left underneath, stripped of the performance, was something much simpler and much worse. A man who had spent 22 years believing his instincts were right, staring at the evidence that they had never been more catastrophically, comprehensively wrong. Caruso, standing 2 feet to his left, had taken one careful step backward without appearing to notice he had done it. Callista let the silence hold for another moment. Let it do the work silence does better than any words. Then she looked at Sergeant Bryce and said, with perfect steadiness, "Thank you, Sergeant. Please remove the cuffs." Pause, precise as a scalpel. "We have a great deal of work to do." The hotel mirror was unforgiving at 6:47 in the morning, which was precisely why Callista Washington had chosen to stand in front of it. She had been awake since 5. Not from nerves, she had made her peace with nerves a long time ago, somewhere between her second federal trial and her first death threat, but from the particular alertness that came the morning before something irrevocable. The kind of morning where the mind refuses to waste itself on sleep because it understands, even before the body does, that everything is about to change. The commissioner's uniform hung on her correctly. She had been fitted for it 10 days ago in a building 3 states away, by a tailor who had measured her twice and said nothing, which she respected. The navy was dark and precise. The gold insignia caught the light. Standing in it, she looked exactly like what she was about to become. The most powerful law enforcement officer in the city of Millbrook, the first black woman to hold the position in the department's 114-year history. A fact the mayor had mentioned 4 times in the press announcement and that Callista herself had not mentioned once. She looked at her reflection for a long moment. Then she reached up and began to unbutton it. She hung the uniform carefully over the back of the desk chair, smoothing the shoulders flat. From the duffel bag on the bed she pulled the gray sweatsuit, zip-up hoodie, matching drawstring pants, white fitted tee underneath, and put it on with the efficiency of someone who had decided something and was done deliberating. Sneakers. No jewelry. Her credentials tucked into the right hoodie pocket where they would stay invisible unless someone put their hands on her first. Her appointment had been public for 72 hours. Her name was in every headline. Her face was in none of them. The mayor's communications team had used a seal, not a photograph, and Callista had made sure of it. By tomorrow morning, every officer in that precinct would know exactly what she looked like. This morning, she was still anonymous. She intended to use every minute of it. She looked at herself one last time in the mirror. A full-figured black woman in a gray sweatsuit, unremarkable, invisible, exactly as planned, and said quietly to her own reflection, "Let's see who you really are." Then she picked up her keys and walked out the door. Rosie's diner smelled the way diners were supposed to smell. Bacon fat and burnt coffee and something sweet underneath both, maple syrup or pie crust, the kind of scent that belonged to a place that had been feeding people the same breakfast for 30 years and intended to keep doing it. Callista pushed through the glass door at 7:09 a.m. and stood for one breath just inside the entrance, letting the room arrange itself in her mind before she moved through it. Corner booth, back wall, sight lines to the entrance, the counter, and the parking lot beyond the far window. She crossed to it without hesitating and slid in, setting nothing on the table because she had nothing to set. A waitress appeared, Carol, according to her name tag, somewhere in her 50s, moving with the careful economy of someone whose feet had been hurting for years but who had stopped expecting sympathy for it. "Coffee," Callista said. "Black. And the eggs scrambled." "Sure thing, hon." She wrapped both hands around the mug when it came and began to watch. The 2 officers at the counter announced themselves before she had finished her first sip. Not loudly, they didn't need to be loud. They had the particular ease of men operating inside a space they had long ago decided belonged to them. When Carol came to refill their cups, the taller one said something that made her smile with her mouth and nowhere else. Callista noted it. When the busboy, 16 at most, slight, moving carefully between the tables, reached past the shorter officer to clear a plate and caught his elbow by accident, the officer's hand shot out and closed around the boy's wrist. Not hard enough to be an incident. Hard enough to be a message. The boy went very still, apologized twice, and retreated to the kitchen without looking up. The officer turned back to his partner and resumed talking as though nothing had interrupted him. Callista's expression did not change. She drank her coffee. In the parking lot, a woman sat on the hood of a Civic with her face in her hands, shoulders moving in the unmistakable rhythm of someone crying without wanting to be seen doing it. A patrol unit was parked 6 spaces away. The officer inside it was looking at his phone. He did not get out. He did not look up. Callista set her mug down and looked back at the room. The busboy had not come back out of the kitchen. Carol was moving between tables with her careful, practiced efficiency. Her smile deployed and redeployed like a tool she had learned to keep sharp. The case was building itself. All she had to do was keep watching. The bell above the door didn't chime so much as announce. Callista heard it before she looked up. The particular aggressive swing of a door opened by someone who had never once in their life considered that other people might be standing on the other side of it. She took one more sip of her coffee, unhurried, and then raised her eyes. Ernest Flynn filled the frame before he cleared it. He was everything his personnel file had suggested and a few things it hadn't. The silver hair cropped close, the beard maintained with the precision of a man who cared about appearances while believing he was above vanity. The broad shoulders carrying 22 years of unchallenged authority the way a coat rack carries weight, without effort and without question. His utility belt was loaded to the point of theater. He moved through the doorway and into the diner the way water moves into a space. Naturally, completely, as though the room had always been waiting to be filled by him. His partner came in behind him, younger by a decade and a half, sharp-jawed, with dark hair and the kind of smile that had learned to appear before it had anything to smile about. He was watching Flynn the way a compass needle watches north, calibrating his own posture and expression against the older man's in real time. They didn't move toward the counter. They stood just inside the entrance and scanned the room, and the room, Callista observed, responded the way it had responded to the officers at the counter earlier. A subtle contraction, forks moving more carefully, conversations finding lower registers, eyes discovering urgent business elsewhere. Flynn's gaze moved in slow, proprietary sweeps. Past the window booth, past the contractor, past Carol, who had already begun recalibrating her trajectory to avoid their orbit. And then it reached the corner booth and it stopped. He looked at Callista the way men like Flynn looked at things they had already decided were problems, not with curiosity but with the flat, assessing patience of someone choosing their approach. She watched him nudge his partner once with his elbow, eyes never leaving her face. They crossed the diner together. Flynn stopped at the edge of her booth and looked down at her from the full elevation of his certainty, thumbs hooking into his belt, and said with the practiced pleasantness of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to cause harm, "You waiting for someone? Or just taking up space?" Callista set her coffee cup down, very slowly, with both hands returning flat to the table, visible, deliberate. She looked up at him and said nothing for 1 full second, long enough to be noticed, short enough to be deniable. Then she said, "Can I help you, officer?" Flynn's pleasantness didn't leave his face so much as curdle inside it. He said there had been a complaint. One of the other patrons, he explained, had flagged her presence as suspicious. She had been sitting too long, bothering people, making the room uncomfortable. He delivered it with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who had told this particular kind of lie so many times it had stopped feeling like one. Callista let him finish. Then she looked past him at the room, at the contractor who was studying his plate with religious intensity, at the young couple by the window who were both staring at the table, at Carol frozen behind the counter with a coffee pot in each hand. Not one face turned toward them. Not one person who looked like someone who had complained about anything. She looked back at Flynn. "I'd like your badge number, please," she said. The pleasantness finished curdling. What replaced it was immediate and total, not rage, which would have been easier to navigate, but something colder. The flat, deliberate displeasure of a man who had just been handed a response he considered an act of war. "Excuse me? Your badge number," she repeated. "I'd like to note it." He leaned forward, one hand coming down on the table's edge, and said very quietly, "Get up. Am I being detained?" The hand left the table. Callista had just enough time to register the shift in his posture before Caruso materialized at her left, bracketing her against the wall of the booth, and then Flynn's hands were on her arms and she was being pulled upright with the efficient, practiced force of someone for whom this motion had long ago become automatic. Her hip caught the table edge. The coffee cup went over. Brown liquid spread across the formica and dripped to the floor as they pressed her forward against the booth's back panel. And she heard the cuffs come off Flynn's belt with a sound she had been expecting since the moment he walked through the door. The metal closed around her right wrist. Then her left, one notch tighter than procedure required. She noted it. Flynn was smiling. Not the performed pleasantness from before. Something more unguarded than that. Something that lived closer to the surface and required less effort to maintain. Caruso was laughing outright, bright and easy. The laugh of a man who was enjoying himself without reservation. Around them, the diner had become a tableau. Forks suspended. Mouth slightly open. The young woman by the window had her phone raised. And she wasn't the only one. Callista could see 3 screens catching the light without turning her head. She filed that too. Flynn didn't take the short way out. There was a side exit 6 feet to their left, closer, more direct, the logical route from the back corner booth to the parking lot. Callista clocked it immediately. Flynn walked her the other way, back through the full length of the diner, and she understood that the route was not incidental. This was not an arrest being conducted efficiently. This was a procession. He steered her with one hand on her upper arm, his grip firm enough to broadcast ownership to everyone watching, and everyone was watching. The diner that had contracted into careful invisibility the moment Flynn walked in had now gone entirely still, the way a room goes still around something it doesn't know how to process. Silverware lay abandoned. A man at the counter had turned fully around on his stool. The 2 officers who had been there all morning, the ones Callista had already noted, sat very straight and looked at their coffee cups. She walked with her chin level. Her face gave nothing. They passed the first booth. The second. A woman in her 30s pressed her back against the window as they went by, her hands flat on the table in front of her. Callista looked straight ahead and continued cataloging. Caruso's position at her left shoulder, the phone screen still raised and recording, the sound of Flynn's boots on the linoleum marking every step with the confidence of a man who believed the audience was his. At the table beside the hostess stand, a little girl, 4 years old, perhaps 5, in a yellow jacket with a hood, looked up at Callista from behind a stack of pancakes and simply began to cry. Not loudly. The silent kind, the kind that happens when a small person sees something their instincts recognize as wrong before their vocabulary can name it. Her mother pulled her close without speaking. Callista saw it. She held it in the same place she was holding everything else. The 2 tight cuffs, the fabricated complaint, the deliberate route through the room, and she kept walking. Behind her, Flynn said something to Caruso, loud enough to carry. Something about the neighborhood, about mornings getting more interesting, delivered with the warm, confiding tone of a man performing for an audience he assumed agreed with him. 1 or 2 people looked away. Nobody laughed. Callista filed the silence of the room the same way she had filed everything else, as evidence, as testimony, as the shape of a thing she would be required to address from a podium very soon. She said nothing. She kept her chin where it was. She kept walking. She was still taking notes. The back seat of the Interceptor smelled of synthetic cleaner and old sweat and something beneath both that no amount of product ever fully neutralized. Callista settled against the molded plastic and adjusted her weight to accommodate her hands cuffed behind her, finding the position that would cause the least cumulative damage over the length of the drive. She had been in worse situations than this. She had been in situations that had genuinely required fear. This was not one of them, which was the only advantage she permitted herself to feel. Flynn started talking before Caruso had finished pulling out of the lot. It wasn't directed at her specifically, which she recognized as its own particular technique, the performance of indifference toward someone you were actively trying to diminish. He spoke to Caruso about the neighborhood, about how it had been changing, about the kind of people that change brought with it. He used the word element twice. He talked about the courts with the weary authority of a man who considered the entire judicial system a personal inconvenience designed to undermine his work. He said the system would sort her out, the phrase landing with the satisfaction of someone setting down something heavy. Caruso contributed laughter at the appropriate intervals. Callista watched Millbrook move past the window. A school. A laundromat. A playground with 2 kids on the swings despite the early hour, both of them pumping their legs hard against the cold morning air, going nowhere and completely absorbed in the effort of it. She watched them until the car turned and they disappeared. Then she said, quietly and without preamble, into a brief gap between Flynn's sentences, "Why did you become a police officer?" The question landed in the front seat and sat there. Flynn stopped talking. The silence lasted long enough that Caruso glanced sideways at him. Then Flynn made a sound, not quite a laugh, more the cousin of one, the version that gets deployed when a real answer would cost too much, and shook his head as though the question were too absurd to dignify. He didn't answer. He picked up a different thread instead, something about paperwork, something about overtime, and the moment passed and the car moved on, and outside the window Millbrook continued to scroll by, indifferent. But the silence where his answer should have been remained in the car for the rest of the drive, taking up more space than either of them acknowledged. Callista felt it. She suspected, on some level beneath the performance and the laughter and the 22 years of accumulated certainty, that Flynn felt it too. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. The Millbrook Police Department's front entrance was designed to communicate authority: wide glass doors, high ceilings, the department seal mounted on the wall behind the front desk at a height that required looking up to read it. Callista had studied the building's schematics 3 weeks ago. She knew the layout better than most of the people who worked inside it. Flynn pushed through the doors first. Caruso steered her through behind him with a hand on her shoulder, and the warmth of the building replaced the morning cold in one immediate exchange. The lobby was mid-morning busy. Phones, movement, the low institutional percussion of a precinct running its standard operations. 2 officers crossing toward the corridor. A civilian at the far window filling out a form. Sergeant Donald Bryce behind the main desk, reading, a coffee mug at his elbow. None of it lasted. Bryce looked up first. The way he did it. Not the casual glance of a desk sergeant registering an incoming arrest, but something that happened faster than that. Some recognition that moved from his eyes to his face to his hands before it reached any other part of him. That was what changed the room. His mug stopped halfway to his mouth. The reading material lowered. He stood. To Callista's left, a young officer carrying a paper cup full of coffee simply lost his grip on it. It hit the floor and the sound was very loud in the quiet that had already begun spreading outward from the front desk like cold moving across a surface. Someone in the back hallway said, "Oh God," in a voice stripped entirely of performance. The involuntary kind, the kind a person makes when the mind arrives at a conclusion the body hasn't caught up to yet. The room crystallized. Flynn felt it before he understood it. She could see the moment it reached him, the way his eyes moved around the space, registering the stillness, the faces, the particular quality of the silence that had replaced the ordinary noise of the precinct. His jaw shifted. The smile, which had survived the diner and the parade and the entire length of the drive, finally faltered. It didn't disappear all at once. It retreated slowly, like something losing the warmth that had been sustaining it. He looked at Bryce, then at the officer who had dropped the cup, then at the hallway where someone had spoken. Beside her, without a word, without appearing to decide to do it, Caruso took 2 full steps backward. Flynn turned to look at him. Then he looked at Callista. For the first time since Rosie's diner, he had no words ready. Callista let the silence hold for 3 full seconds. She had learned this a long time ago in courtrooms and federal briefings and the kinds of rooms where careers were decided in the space between sentences. That silence, applied correctly, did more work than language. It had mass. It had direction. And right now it was doing exactly what she needed it to do, pressing down on every set of shoulders in the lobby while Flynn stood in the middle of it and felt, perhaps for the first time in 22 years, the specific discomfort of a room that was no longer arranged in his favor. Then she turned to face him. She didn't raise herself up or squarely set her jaw or do any of the things that anger produces in a body. She simply turned, with the unhurried steadiness of someone who had arrived somewhere she had always been going, and looked at Ernest Flynn directly. He met her eyes and then, fractionally, looked away. She noted it. She turned to Sergeant Bryce. "My identification," she said, her voice the same temperature it had been in the diner, in the car, through all of it. Even and clear and requiring nothing from anyone in the room except their attention. "Right hoodie pocket. I'd like someone to retrieve it, please." Bryce moved to her immediately. His hands, when they reached into the pocket, were not entirely steady. He withdrew the credential wallet, slim, dark leather, worn at one corner from regular use, and opened it with the careful movements of a man who already knew what he was going to find and was bracing for the weight of it. He held it up. The room saw it before Flynn did. Callista watched the information travel. A desk officer's breath leaving him audibly, the young officer who had dropped the cup pressing back against the wall, someone near the corridor doorway reaching out to grip the frame. Commissioner Callista M. Washington. Millbrook Police Department. Flynn read it. She watched him read it. Watched his face move through 5 distinct expressions in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion first, then a grasping, reluctant recalibration, then something that might have been the beginning of understanding, then a brief, terrible blankness as the full architecture of what he had done assembled itself completely, and finally, underneath all of it, stripped of every layer the uniform and the years and the badge had provided, the raw, unguarded face of a man who understood that everything was already over. Callista watched all 5. She catalogued them the same way she had catalogued everything else since 7 that morning. Then she looked at Bryce and said, quietly, "Thank you, Sergeant. Please remove the cuffs." She wore the uniform this time. The commissioner's navy sat on her the same way it had at 6:47 that morning in the hotel mirror, correctly, precisely, with the gold insignia catching the light at her collar. The difference was that now the full precinct was assembled in front of her, every officer on duty and several who weren't, standing in rows in the department's main hall with the particular posture of people who understood that what was happening was not routine and were still in the process of deciding what it was. Flynn's badge lay on the podium. She had placed it there herself, without ceremony, before anyone arrived. It sat face up under the fluorescent lights, and nobody in the room could look at it without understanding exactly what it meant. Callista looked out at them for a moment before she spoke. Then she talked about the diner, not about Flynn. Not by name, not by badge number. Not in any way that made what had happened to her the subject of the address. She talked instead about every person who had been in Rosie's diner that morning and had watched a woman in handcuffs walk the length of the room and had found something very important to look at on their plates. She talked about what it cost a community to be protected by people who required them to look away. She talked about the busboy who had apologized twice for an accident that wasn't his fault, and the woman crying in the parking lot while a unit sat 6 spaces away, and she talked about what it meant that neither of those things had apparently required anyone's attention until today. Then she talked about a little girl in a yellow jacket who had started to cry. She didn't explain why the girl had cried. She didn't need to. A 5-year-old sitting in a booth with a plate of pancakes had understood immediately and instinctively what every adult in that room had trained themselves not to see. She let that sit with them. She let it settle into the places where comfortable assumptions lived. She picked up Flynn's badge, held it level, face out, so the room could see it clearly. This, she said, is not a crown. It is not a weapon. It is not a pass. It is a promise, made to every person in this city, without exception, without condition, without the luxury of personal discretion about who deserves it. She set it back down. The test is over, she said. But the work, the real work, starts right now. The hall was very quiet. Outside, through the high windows, Millbrook was already moving through its morning. Ordinary and complicated and entirely dependent on the people standing in this room to decide, every single day, what kind of city it was going to be. Callista gathered her notes, straightened them once against the podium, and looked up. "Get to it," she said. "Here is the outro adapted for your story and character. It's a powerful reminder that power and authority are not the same thing. A badge can grant one. Only character can earn the other." Callista Washington walked into that diner with every reason to announce herself. The title, the appointment, the weight of the office already resting on her shoulders, and she chose instead to be silent. To watch. To let the truth show itself without interference. Because she understood something that Flynn never did. You don't learn who people really are by telling them who you are first. She endured the cuffs. She endured the parade through that diner, past every averted eye, past that little girl in the yellow jacket. She stayed silent in the back of that squad car and listened to two men who believed completely, without a single moment of doubt, that they had her figured out. And not once, did she give them the satisfaction of being wrong about her composure, even as they were catastrophically wrong about everything else. So here's the question I want to leave with you today. What would you have done in Callista's position? Would you have revealed your identity the moment Flynn put his hands on the table? Stopped it before it started? Or would you have done exactly what she did? Stayed quiet, stayed watching, and let the rope run long enough for the truth to hang itself? There's no wrong answer. But I think about that little girl crying, and I think Callista made the right call. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you the way it moved me, hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it genuinely helps this channel reach people who need to hear stories like this one. Subscribe and ring the bell so you're here the next time justice shows up somewhere it wasn't expected. It always does, eventually.